Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us from all the different places where you are located. This webinar is an activity of the International Psychoanalytic Association Communications Committee under the coordination of Mariano Ruperthus and the direction of Sylvia Warnbach. The webinar is being recorded, so those of you who have registered who cannot attend online right now will be able to watch it later. After that, the video will be accessible on YouTube for the public. The speaker's opinion are personal and are not institutional positions. This webinar, Death and Illness in the Psychoanalytic Process, is recorded now at a time when we are well aware that some of you have been blindsided and traumatized by the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Our hearts go out to you, but I want to be sure you know this is more in the usual situation, which is often horrifying on its own, when death and illness interferes with the psychoanalytic process. We are fortunate to have three psychoanalysts who have expertise in this area. Dr. Audrey Kavka, Tove Træsdal, and Gabriele Junkers. The webinar structure will be, for the first part, each of the participants will give a 10 to 12, perhaps another minute presentation. We will then discuss among ourselves and open it to questions from the audience. There is a chat box in the bottom right of your screen. Take a look at it now, because at any time during the webinar, you may post a question. Be sure you know that we will not address the questions until after the four of us actually have a chance to discuss the presentations, but there should be plenty of time to address the questions. So, without further ado, let me introduce myself as moderator. I'm Brenda Solomon from the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. I'm a training and supervising analyst, and I have taught ethics for a long time at the Institute, and recently got very involved in this subject because I was analyzing an analytic candidate who got a dreadful metastatic diagnosis, and it was a complex and difficult area for me to decide whether I was going to focus on the analyst or on her patients. So you'll hear much more of that, but let me begin with our first speaker. Remember, you can put your questions anytime in the chat box and we will address them later. Dr. Audrey Kavka is a supervisor and faculty member of the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. She has been working in the field of aging and professional ethics for over 40 years. She's the author of the American Psychoanalytic Association sponsored book, Psychoanalytic Assistance Casebook. She is past chair of the IPA Committee's Psychoanalytic Perspectives on the Aging of Patients and Psychoanalysts, as well as chair of the American Psychoanalytic Study Group on Aging and Psychoanalytic Education. Dr. Audrey's presentation will be Darkness and Light, Shades of Death in the Analytic Process. Audrey?
Okay. All right, there we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending and showing your interest in our topic. I'm so pleased to be invited to speak in this webinar about things that are historically treated as unspeakable. In 2004, Franco Damasi wrote on making death thinkable. In this webinar, we hope to break existing barriers in order to speak about death in the analytic process and move towards making death thinkable. In a recently released book, Psychoanalytic Intersections, edited by Elise Miller, Nancy McWilliams writes, "We should be talking together, as analysts traditionally do, about topics that are hard to keep in consciousness and that are not welcomed by our social conventions. And we should be speaking in the presence of colleagues of all ages about getting old, dying, and other unalterable realities. And here we are today doing exactly that. And although I have written and spoken on various aspects of bringing psychoanalytic perspectives to clinical work with aging patients, my brief talk today is the first time I've written and spoken on this specific aspect. I think of it as a work in progress and hope it will be enough to engage your thoughts, experiences, and interests. My first contact with late life patients dates to 1979, when I was a resident assigned to hospitalized patients. With attention on the inner person, the patients use the treatments to come alive and live, not to prepare to die. Years later, I found shades of this experience in the theoretical work of Guillermo Montero. His work on maturation shines a light on finding meaning and purpose in living from midlife onward. This experience of older patients turning towards life was pleasing and repeated in my move to analyzing older individuals in private practice. The first time actual patient death disrupted an ongoing treatment was quite a different thing. The patient's initial complaint was increasing social isolation, and it was some time before she was able to acknowledge an increasing neurological disability contributing to her state of anxious depression. The internal focus of our work brought a sense of closeness and timelessness. We both felt nourished by the amazing vitality of her inner life and her growing capacity to bear inner conflict. We certainly could not ignore the progression of the illness, yet it felt like a shock when she was admitted to a nursing facility with death to follow in less than a week. Our final visit was at her bedside. As I walked away, I wondered if it was worth it to continue this kind of work in which illness and death would inevitably force a grief-filled ending. This was a dark moment. Light returned with word from her family about the awakened generativity the patient had shown through the course of our work. This is not the kind of ending that we are taught about in our training years. I believe we are taught a model vision of termination. Given the complex realities of life, we all experience terminations that do not conform to the ideal, but do reflect our best efforts for a good enough termination phase and final ending. Unilaterally, patients may choose an educational, job, or relationship opportunity that disrupts an ongoing analytic process, a process that enabled them to move forward in life. Other patients leave prematurely, acting out the limits of their ability to bear the internal pressures aroused in the transference, and analytic work. Another unilateral ending that is not taught or spoken about often enough is analyst retirement. I am currently in the process of retirement. This unilateral decision has introduced shockwaves into each treatment and transference-countertransference constellation. For many, analyst retirement evokes a symbolic death with fears of actual pending death. My patients study everything about me to detect if I am ill or dying. They wonder if they've harmed me. Are they too much for me? How will they know if I die after we end? They want to comfort me if I am dying. Analyst retirement strips away the soothing thought, oh, maybe I will return for more treatment if and when I need you in the future. I too feel the powerful sorrow of forever and finality. I think we all feel this. Some colleagues have explicitly replaced the harsh word termination with the softer word ending in their clinical lexicon. Analyses that seem to never end are also very interesting. Can there be a fantasy of putting off death? This is a long way of getting to the situation in which neither patient nor analyst determine the ending of the analysis. I think this is the one we are least likely to prepare for as we unconsciously attempt to keep death away. Excuse me. When patient illness and expectations of death enter the analytic space, analyst and patient alike are confronted with the realness of death, with its frightening and disturbing characteristics of finality, uncertainty, the unknown, and unknowable. Neither patient nor analyst will have the final say on the end of treatment. Both will contend with feelings of impotence, fear, and grief. The immediacy of life with illness comes to the fore. Questions arise. The most sought after are often the most unanswerable. Will I die? When will I die? How will I die? What comes after the death of my body? The pressure to know what cannot be known awakens primitive terrors, revival of traumatic experiences of dependency, and desperate feelings of helplessness. The analyst is likely to feel all this too. It's a time of disequilibrium in the treatment. Intense transferences to the medical doctors spring to life. Tests and treatments disrupt the regularity of the analytic schedule. As external reality takes center stage, the analyst may even wonder, what do I have to offer in this altered situation? Questions of what is analytic and what is supportive emerge. Can they coexist? From one point of view, the analytic frame is under tremendous distorting pressure. From another point of view, the internal analytic frame is the analyst's strength. Commitment to an ongoing analytic process in which patient and analyst struggle together to bear the present in anticipation of the future, both internal and external, supports the frightened and grieving patient. When I can deeply accept that I am helpless to treat the physical illness and prevent death, I am supported by my conviction that I am not helpless to be with my patient and let mourning enter the room. In following this conviction, I have worked with a considerable number of patients, both in therapy and analysis, to the end of life. The moment of death separates us forever. We are left as onlookers to the ever mysterious experience of death. I have observed and learned, suffered, grieved, and grown. An uncomfortable thought, maybe a truth, emerges from my experience. Death is the ultimate experience of aloneness, unlike any other. I wonder if it is exactly this that is so terrifying to contemplate. I've observed that dying patients in treatment seem to apprehend this at some preconscious level and begin well before death to turn towards their inner objects. Inner objects will be the companions in the death experience. And this is where we as analysts in our work come in. In the face of death for both analyst and patient, the state of the inner objects is of the greatest importance. Will the inner world be dominated by persecutory companions? Will loving and beloved objects be available within to soften the experience of aloneness? And what will be the inner self state at the time of death? Every patient is different. How the work proceeds once illness and death enter the analytic process is often shaped by three significant variables. One, the state of the transference and working through the past when the illness intrudes. Imagine a chronically hypomanic patient who seeks the attention of men to keep grief of early father loss at bay, and in the transference can cast the analyst as another fantasied admirer, propping up a vulnerable core. The analyst observes that as the patient's health declines, she begins to identify with her young widowed mother, whom she begins to see as sturdy and brave in the face of loss and widowhood. The patient suffers with punishing regret for lifelong devaluation of mother. Change is underway, but will there be time for the mourning process and internal reparation? 2, the state of countertransference. Imagine an analysis in which hard work has enabled the aggressively narcissistic patient who wants to believe he raised himself is now able to feel his dependency and loving feelings for the analyst, his wife, and family. Yet analysis seems to come to a standstill until the analysts recognize they have colluded to keep out age and death, and thus begin a termination process. 3, the analyst's dynamic ability to tolerate close contact with the vulnerability of mortality and death. I propose that we, as the psychoanalytic community, can do more to support each other in our individual struggles with the painful facts of life. We can increase attention to issues of vulnerability and mortality in our training analyses, and provide curriculum and education on the full life cycle, aging, retirement, illness, mortality, and death, early in candidacy and throughout the analytic career, to help us to bear illness and death in our analyses and personal lives. In conclusion, challenging as it is, if we can bear our own vulnerabilities attached to mortality, I believe that analytic treatment can play a crucial role and provide invaluable support to patients when illness and death enter the analytic process. This is a bright shaft of light that can break through the darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. We now will turn to Dr. Tove Træsdal from Norway. She is.
This is Gabriele.
Here we are. Tove is now retired, working.
No, you have the wrong sequence.
Gabriele.
Oh, Gabriele is going next. I am so sorry. It's my misunderstanding. Gabriele Junkers is a training analyst at the DPV, that is the German Psychoanalytic Society, I believe. She has published in Psychoanalytic, Gerontology, and Institutional Matters, particularly The Empty Couch, which I'll show you in a minute, which was sort of my Bible when I retired. She's now has a new book, Living and Containing Psychoanalysis in Institutions, in 2022, published by Routledge. She has worked for the EPF executive, that's the European Psychoanalysis, as editor of the EPF Bulletin, an honorary speaker as chair of the Committee on Training, and founding the EPF Forum on Aging and the IPA Committee on Aging of Patients and Analysts. The title of her presentation is Ending, with a question mark. Please, Gabriele.
Thank you, Brenda. And welcome to all the colleagues listening, and thank you for taking your time and effort to making this possible. Today, exactly 10 years after having published the book, The Empty Couch, I will focus again on the problems of ending in the analyst, as they may have a strong impact on the analyst himself, his analytic tools, on his analysand and the analytic process, and that may also involve colleagues and psychoanalytic institutions, as well as our analytic reputation in general. Analysts are known as to be members of an aging profession. They have often already passed a peak in their lifetime when ending their analytic training. It it is all too understandable that at an age when some people in midlife are already beginning to mourn that finality comes into view, we put this aside because as recently qualified analysts, we feel the magic of a new beginning. Some analysts rave about our profession. We can work as long as we want, not feeling restricted by rules from outside. And I remember a young colleague who voiced passionately in his admission interview, I want eventually to die behind the couch. What does this tell us? Having held a number of different posts in analytic institutional life, national and international, I have witnessed, observed, experienced, and discussed my impressions with colleagues that as analysts, we tend to do exactly what Freud describes in 1915. We eliminate our ending from our side, behaving as if everything will go on as usual. This led me to the conclusion that many analysts show a tendency to turn a blind eye to aging, to vulnerability, to finality, and especially to thinking about preparing ahead for an eventual death. Instead, they say, later, perhaps. Let us now try to understand this. It was a long road, first to achieve our basic profession, and then our psychoanalytic training. But lucky enough to know that having qualified, we became members of a group, a society or association that we intensely longed to belong to. As members, we have agreed to conduct ourselves and to treat patients according to professional principles within the frame of a code of ethics. This includes having agreed to ensure that only work when we are in good enough health. In our analytic work, we are used to concentrating on our inner world of our patients, on the inner world of our patients throughout our working day, only focusing on ourselves in respect to content. I guess it is exactly this that leaves us little time or energy to take care of our private selves. I formed the impression that as analysts, we strongly dislike monitoring our own bodily grounding in order to attentively detect if something is not well or has changed in comparison to earlier times. Not only delegating it on doctors, but feeling it ourselves. With aging, this monitoring becomes ever more important, but at the same time, it requires more daring because it involves the risk of realizing the loss of what we were used to and the possibility of falling ill, which could turn into an experience of disaster. Preparing for an eventual ending, we need to keep in mind a wide span of time, possibly the 10 years of work before ending. This requires a sense of time and a vision of an end in order to be able to plan ahead. When do I want to take my last patient? How can I know in what state I will be in 5 to 10 years from now? In an EPF conference, comparable to the training analyst in his 5 first years, I offered a seminar titled A Training Analyst Facing His Last Years of Analytic Work. What does this tell us? That one colleague turned finally up. I have heard analysts saying, ending work is too hard. It is like dying. They doubt, who am I if not an analyst? It is as if they visualize the space beyond professional life as a black hole. Facing my own process of aging implies letting the notion of finality enter my personal behavior and beginning to mourn what I feel is or will be lost. At the same time, I have to acknowledge the intense resistance to doing precisely this without secretly escaping from the task.
Gabriele, can you speak a little closer to your microphone, please? Yes.
And at the same time, I have to acknowledge the intense resistance to doing precisely this without secretly escaping from the task when it is left to me to develop a vision of my own ending. Doing analysis requires a healthy body. Theoretically, all of us know that every organ of the body contributes to the well-functioning of the brain. In daily life, we easily forget to apply this to ourselves. Too easily we forget that our analytic tools, including our awareness, listening, taking in, thinking, reflecting, remembering, and feeling, depend on the well-functioning of our body as well as our brain. Our analytic mind would not exist if we would not have a body, a somatic hardware that enables us to think, to feel, to supply us with an emotional life, as well as the possibility of orientating ourselves during the fire of our work. It is not well known that the onset of neurological problems, possibly finally developing into dementia, is often announced by a so-called premonitory depression, which is mostly resistant to medication. I have been surprised how helpful the analytic tool of countertransference can be in identifying a possible onset of a dementing process behind depressive symptoms. In guaranteeing the requirements of professional standards in respect of good enough health, we are dealing with a very difficult and complex situation. The assessing authority is given to the individual analyst. Yet, as analysts, we should know that exactly the required judgment might be subjected to wishful thinking or repression, or might be impaired by a somatic illness, or by the onset of neurological disturbance that smooths the way for forgetting about these requirements. A supporting and caring institutional frame in the form of rules and delimitation is indispensable, but the necessary monitoring tools are often ineffective due to a lack of positive support. Analysts tend to fear any restrictions of their so-called private rights and tend to show a lack of confidence in colleagues and the reasoning of an institution. The argument is, this is totally private. This introduces another question of a taboo, the discussion of what is private and what is official or institutional, belonging to the group needing to be regulated. There is a great need to shed more light on the question of how we are living and working together in order to finally reach an institutional clarification of the question, what is private, what needs to be of concern to the profession, if guarantees of the quality of our work are backed by the institution we originally wanted so urgently to belong to. Ending is closely related to separation and finality. The ability to actively decide on a conscious act of ending requires a sense of factual reality, a vision and anticipation of a future development, eventually unpleasurable, while at the same time being convinced of its necessity. I then have to face the passage of time, not only in relation to the world, but also from a third position in relation to myself, monitoring my own aging and mourning, what needs eventually to be given up, what feels lost and will never come back. Our professional credo, what that we always have plenty of time, does not stand up to reality now. Yet we often behave as if it would. How can we take in this reality? There is a big difference between reading or discussing an analytic paper on illness and death and really facing the passage of time in relation to myself. I am afraid we mostly prefer the former and avoid the latter. Recently, I have described how far-reaching problems with ending might lurk in other areas of our work. They tend to occur in tiny moments of institutional working together in psychoanalytic institutions. I have described a strong dislike for limitations, a dislike for creating structures as necessary frames for our planning ahead. We can often observe how we avoid the separation in completing a final report or in setting a proper end to a long-lasting committee work. Is this dislike of separation transmitted from one generation to the next? In short, I wanted to convey the following points today. We need to bring the dislike of getting older out of the dark into the light. One example could be to expand the psychoanalytic curriculum on developmental psychoanalysis to the full human life cycle. Another would be creating a culture of rituals that could help to deal with something that seems individually, emotionally too painful to deal with, so we can get help by the group. We would need a differentiated discussion of what is private and what is institutional, but a discussion that leads to decisions and facts, avoiding a later, perhaps.
I didn't hear that. Say that again a little closer.
We would need a differentiated discussion of what is private and what is institutional, but a discussion that finally leads to decision and facts, avoiding a later, perhaps. There is a great need to discuss of how we organize our living and working together and regulating what might exceed the emotional capacity of the individual. But the problem remains. For many of us, ending the analytic work means facing unbearable anxieties in relation to death. But could we not think of saying goodbye to the work as analyst would bring us the freedom for a new beginning of something we do not know yet? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriele. And now we will turn to Tove Træsdal from Norway. Tove worked for several years in a psychiatric hospital treating young adults with severe psychiatric illness before she established her private practice in 1990. She specialized in treating traumatized mothers with small children. She was a training and supervising analyst at the Institute of Psychotherapy, Oslo, Norway. Tove has had a parallel career, remarkable, as a classical singer, giving solo recitals and occasionally joining the chorus of the Norwegian opera, Oslo. The title of her presentation, The Psychoanalyst Dies, an Existential Challenge. Tove?
Thank you. In 2001, my 60-year-old analyst died from acute cardiac arrest a few hours after my Friday session. Some 4 years later, she had succeeded my first analyst, a man in his late 60s who had to terminate his practice abruptly when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was faced with the reality of dying within, at the most, a year. Between the age of 18 months and 3 years, I had suffered several painful separation experiences. My mother got cancer and was undergoing hospital treatments and surgery. This was in 1950, and the impact on young children of traumatizing separations was yet to be understood and taken into consideration. So it goes without saying that the last thing I needed was having to deal with sickness and death in my analyst. From the outset, I had been confident that psychoanalysis would be the most, or maybe the only, possible road to repair some consequences of my early traumatic experiences. Thanks to my third deeply meaningful analytics experience with a female analyst, I was indeed able to bring my analytic journey to a closure, which provided integration and enhanced joy of life. It took a while, though, before I was able to start yet another analysis, and waiting was painful. The fact that I was a therapist myself and could reflect on what had happened to me proved helpful. I read almost everything that had been written about the theme of illness and death in the Analyst. I then wrote an article on the topic in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Some 10 years later, Gabriele invited me to write a chapter for her book, The Empty Couch. My presentation here will represent a short summary of the main points that are discussed in these articles. Firstly, I will talk a little about preventive measures. Sickness and death may happen to anybody at any time, even if we are inclined to deny it. Very often in long-term psychoanalytic therapies, the issue of losing the therapist will surface, especially whenever there was early separation or loss in the patient's history. Even though these worries, for the most part, ought to be treated as fantasy material and addressed or interpreted as such, I think that it is important that it is discussed on the reality level at least once, preferably early in the process. To me, it was very helpful to have talked with my first analyst about this on the reality level, remembering his suggestion that I might contact one of his colleagues with whom he shared premises. It helped me in my confused state to know that there was someone out there to whom I might turn. The way my analyst expressed himself, I felt no pressure, though, to follow his advice. I remained free to find my own solution. Whenever the analyst is faced with terminal illness, but still has some time to assist the patient as to how to proceed, it has been pointed out that it is inadvisable to assign the patient to a specific colleague for continued analysis. It is tempting to think that to provide a secure foster home for one's patient would be the most caring thing to do. But it doesn't take much afterthought to imagine that such an arrangement can in fact complicate matters for both parties. Time doesn't allow for elaborating this. I will now focus on a few of the issues that arise by abrupt and premature termination of an analysis. From the literature and from personal experience, I think that one should avoid too many strong opinions about how to proceed. Questions like, should the patient immediately enter a new treatment? Should it be with someone who knew the deceased, etc., cannot be generalized, but need to be regarded in each particular case, depending on many factors. Among them is, of course, the reality of availability of professionals to assist. Most authors emphasize the importance of offering the bereft patient some immediate possibility to meet with another analyst who can help him or her in the first phase of grief, confusion, or whatever the reactions may be. In this phase, the exchange should be concentrated on helping the patient to share the loss. This is written about as a bridging function, and it is recommended that this person should preferably know the deceased. The patient needs the opportunity to have his or her perception of the analyst as a real person confirmed. There is also the need to describe the impact of the loss, to speak about what the analyst meant to the analysand. Not much more is demanded of the therapist than simply compassionate listening, and such sessions will serve the purpose of dissolving some of the transference and making the analyst more real. The patient also needs to sort out how to proceed further, whether or not to start another analysis, etc. It is important to be aware of the fact that losing one's analyst has a twofold meaning. One loses the analysis with the investment of hope for change and possible alleviation of suffering, and one loses a very important real relationship with another person. On the other hand, it is generally recommended that starting a new analysis, the new analyst should preferably not know the deceased. When I read this literature, I was aware of to what extent these ideas were irrelevant to small communities, as here in Norway, where almost everybody knows everybody. I actually think that what is more important is the quality of the relationship between the new analyst and the deceased. It goes without saying that dislike of or conflicts with the former analyst will be counterproductive. So will probably a very different theoretical stance. I think that competitiveness or narcissistic needs, for instance, the need to become a rescuer of an analytic orphan, are more important factors than whether or not the analysts knew each other. There is one aspect about the loss which I didn't see dealt with in the literature when I wrote my articles back in the days. An analytic patient finds him or herself in a unique situation when it comes to communicating with others. In everyday life, we have two sets of dialogues going on, one inwardly to ourselves and one in the exchange with other people. Within the analysis, the inner dialogue through free association is extended to include another person, the analyst. So, the analytic dialogue is unlike any other dialogue in the patient's life and is as such irreplaceable in real life. This extension of the inner dialogue gets to a sudden halt when the analyst isn't available anymore, but may continue in the patient's mind. It may then be very difficult for a bereft patient to communicate in a meaningful way about the analysis in everyday language. A colleague put it this way: the person with whom you need to share your feelings about what has happened is the very person who is dead. For me, it took a long time after my second analyst died to be able to talk sensibly about my state of mind. Unfortunately, a first bridging analyst had no intuitive understanding of how blurred and confused everything was, and I was completely unable to explain to her how I reacted. I think that the most important thing that is required of an analyst called upon to assist a bereft analysand is to allow space and time for the patient to recover from the immediate trauma. I will strongly warn against being in any sense officious, whether that is in the sense of interpreting transference aspects of the relationship between the patient and the deceased, or in offering conclusive ideas about how the patient should proceed. Compassionate listening and refraining from conclusions will be the best recipe. Considerable time may be needed. If the relationship between the bridging analyst and the patient develops into a fruitful working alliance, I think that there is no reason why they shouldn't continue the work developing into a new analysis. This would protect the patient from seeing more professionals than strictly necessary. The new analyst's schedule may not allow starting a new analysis on short notice, but then I think that the low frequency contact until time will be available mostly will be better than another referral. Finally, I shall briefly comment upon dyadic and triadic aspects of a new analytic relationship. Whatever one's theoretic stance may be, emphasis on the dyadic interaction will normally be the primary ingredient in any analytic process. When starting a new analytic process with someone who lost his or her analyst, I think that it is important to conceptualize the work as fundamentally triadic. The technical approach of interpreting most everything in terms of transference within the current analytic diet will probably not be fruitful in this special case. To bring oneself too early into the picture as a transferential object may interfere with the deeper aspects of mourning. When leaving space for amalgamating the former analytic process into the new one by showing a non-judgmental curiosity about what went on in the dyad with the deceased analyst may eventually enrich the patient, who then is free to use the discoveries made through the first analysis as building blocks for further work with a new analyst. To be accompanied through one's inner landscape by two knowledgeable escorts may presumably lead to a richer outcome, provided that the new companion refrains from competing with the first over who is the better company. Thank you.
Thank you, Tove. There are so many things to pay attention to in these three presentations. I'd like to go back, though, to Gabriele for a moment, because I'm afraid that some of the microphone difficulty didn't allow us to hear some of your recommendations. So I think that best, as I recall, there was some hope that the institution where the analyst belongs will offer some workshops on end of life and or retirement. Is there something more that I should have you repeat, Gabriele? I'm so sorry, because some of the microphone was a little fuzzy.
Very sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. When you're closer, it's much better.
I try my very best, yeah. It's so difficult to say what should people do, but I think the easiest is to invite somebody from outside, or to take some articles on this topic, to have a third or something foreign to be present in the room when discussing about difficult things. Difficult things, I mean taboos. We are, as analysts, used not to speak about aging, not to speak about illness, not to speak about money, and several other things. And I think as analysts, we think we should serve truth to come into the room. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, we are suppressing truth. And I think this is the dilemma we have to bring to light in our groups. And I think the more big the group is, the easier it is. The smaller the group is, the more difficult it is, because one has a history together. And everybody knows, oh, with this topic, I cannot talk to that. And if I say this, this person will be hurt. So it is important that smaller groups try to have some mediator or outside person to work with them, even perhaps online. I have heard of many groups that took some help from outside and found it extremely supportive.
Thank you, thank you. I think my institution, and I think many Americans, have formed a psychoanalytic assistance committee, so that if there's someone in the, whether patient or a supervisee, or someone is concerned about the aging of an analyst who is not functioning at the best, they can bring it to the Psychoanalytic Assistance Committee, which will then handle it with empathy and support, but not deny that something is going on. It's not easy to do, but I think it's really a positive development in our institutions. Were you going to say something, Gabriele?
Exactly. This assistance committee, which Audrey did so much work upon, about, I tried to bring it into my own society, but again, with the answer, this is private. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps you can understand that I brought this discussion in an institution who is striving for qualitative work and stressing candidates to do something like qualitative work, unable to do something to protect the quality of work in the institution.
That's sad. That's sad. But if you can get it at least into your curriculum and developmental stage and age life and post-retirement, I think that's the issue, that most analysts who are denying their aging and diminishing capacities, they can't imagine a life past retirement. And I think there could be workshops about that.
Yeah.
Not everyone needs to be a professional singer like Tove, but I do think we all have capacities to find meaning, even though it's so hard to give up our psychoanalytic identity. There's one more thing I'd like to...
Can I add something, Brenda? I was thinking that throughout all three papers, you know, we raise the observations and some understanding of how death is threatening to analysts in the same way that it is threatening to anybody. But what Gabriele is bringing up is something we didn't really touch on so much, which is the analyst whose illness, development of illness may enter the scene as well, and that illness may have impact on their capacity to function at the full capable level as an analyst. And what I have had a lot of experience with this from the American Psychoanalytic on how to help an individual who seems to be having trouble, but is clearly not attending to it. Why are they not attending to it? In my sense, they're not attending to it because they can't bear it. It's a truth that they cannot bear, and what they need actually is assistance, not judgment. They need to be assisted to accept something that feels unbearable and intolerable. Now, what I have found in experience, why at Gabriele's Society, they say it's too private to talk about, is I do think the other theme that we've been talking about today, and that other theme is the wish not to see death or decline or any kind of loss, including loss of analytic function. So often when I was introducing the concept of psychoanalyst assistance, people's first response is always, oh yes, you know, I know somebody who seems to have dementia and we need to tell them to retire. That's the whole wrong attitude. I think that attitude comes from this fear of death and decline. What they're really saying is, let's get them out so that we don't have to see them. Seeing them frightens us. Yes, we're concerned about their influence on patients. They're absolutely of top priority, but the top priority is to see the truth and assist that person. It isn't just to get rid of them. Now, if you feel like your colleagues just want to get rid of you, that's very different than feeling your colleagues want to help you to do the right things for your patient. That's the point I want to make.
I'd like to add one thing that hasn't come up, but did come up. We have had a number of analysts, either in a car accident or a sudden myocardial infarction, just drop dead. And no one was prepared for that. There wasn't even discussed with the patients that the possibility. That's why Tove's recommendation early in the analysis, it's good to talk about what happens if. But what I really recommend is that every psychoanalyst have what's called a psychoanalytic will, so that your patient's name, either email or phone numbers are listed, and you give that in a sealed envelope to a trusted younger colleague. So should something happen unexpectedly, there is someone, not a family member of the deceased, but a colleague who can call and inform the patients. I think I'm sorry to say, there are just too many of those instances where no one knew. Patient showed up to an office and there was nothing on the door and they didn't know what happened. So I think it's really important, if we possibly can get across, that a psychoanalytic will is a protective measure. And the one other really surprising thing is, for this person who is handling the analyst who deceased, we have to know their voicemail password in order to get in and change the voicemail on the analyst's phone. It seems like such a practical reasonable thing to do that nobody thinks about it, but it's important because, of course, you want to change if everyone calls the analysts, that there's something they're saying, I'm sorry, Dr. John Smith will not be available, but please call Tove Træsdal to get more information. I mean, that's so important because we don't think of it. Yes, Tove.
Yes, can I say something? Because this matter of being so reluctant to talk about aging and dementia and death and everything, it astonishes me because at my age we talk about it all the time among friends. So it's not so easy to understand. But I think since it is this way, couldn't these questions be put into the basic education as analysts, being an ingredient in the basic courses that people go into, so that they are prepared to think about planning ahead for, and I mean, most of the people who train to become analysts are not 25 years, they are a little older. So
Yes, Gabriele.
May I just add one tiny aspect of the professional will, which I find extremely important, and have also found in some societies reluctance to install it as binding. But there's also a question: how can the patient be informed by someone who is an analyst? This is an institutional question. Even if a professional will exists, I have experienced that one patient was informed about the death of her analyst by reading in the tube the newspaper announcement next from the person sitting next to her. Or another one wanted to call her analyst for to clarify the next meeting, and the son was there, and he said, "No, my father's dead." And these things need to be handled in a very caring way. And I think our anxiety to get in touch with these topics makes it difficult to really have a caring atmosphere.
Right. Well, I think this webinar may help a bit, but I do think I wasn't sure are you saying that an analyst should not be the person who calls? Were you saying that, Gabriele?
It would be nice if an analyst would call the patient to have the tactful way of talking to him or her.
Yes, that's, I agree. And Tove, you are the expert in losing 2 analysts. I am so sorry you had to go through that, but you offer so many perspectives on how to do it correctly. And I'm glad you found someone who finally knew how to do that.
yes, she did. Yes.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions. I'm going to read them. Here's the first. Is there something to be said about the illness or the death that is expected or even anxiously desired that does not come, or at least not in the way fantasized? Do you understand that question? Do we all have some fantasies of our death? And can we work on that? I think I think that's the question. And that's why I think Gabriele's idea that a 10-year before retirement plan, if you begin to think about it as an appropriate way to think about late life development, is developing a plan. And I did not know about the premonitory depression that people say exists before dementia, which I think is really interesting and difficult to pick up, but I do think it's important to know that.
Well, I just have one question about the question, and I assume it's maybe open, but are we talking about the analyst or the patient?
You mean the patient in the negative transference wishes the analyst dead? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's about death of the analyst, but what about death of the patient? Is it good? Are they talking, is there something said about the patient who expects illness or death may even desire it, like a suicidal, chronically suicidal patient that does not come? I don't know what the writer had in mind.
Rest will get clarity. Yes, Gabriele.
Well, given that there is an anxiety among analysts to face this vulnerability and all this what I mentioned, there must be an attitude to avoid these actively bringing in the analysis. Because I think there are many opportunities while analyzing or doing analysis with a patient to bring in something that comes near to it, like separation and all this.
Right.
And if we would be more daring to really face this during the analysis, perhaps this would change a bit. I remember a long time ago, I had an interview with a patient, and it was visible or sensible that the mother must be quite old. And I brought in the question, what about, do you worry a bit about your mother? And then he said, she will never die. And this is something you can use very well in the treatment later on. So I think there are opportunities, although death is not in the room yet, to bring a bit more familiarity with it.
Right, right. Here's the next question. The issue of anxieties in the face of ending in our analytic work raises a few questions. Do we get too much from our work? Do we overly affect our work? Anyone like to answer that? Yes. And go ahead, Gabriele.
I think, well, in a broad way, if we would not have had something lacking in our primary relations to our primary objects, we would never have taken all the work upon ourselves to get this profession. As Ferro puts it, we are all hurt children. And I translated, we are all children that have more or less some problems with the others, and to be very confident in others. And so I think the analytic work is a sort of retreat we can use for ourselves. This is an apology for not doing other things. And I meet always analysts working from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. And my question is, what happens in such a mind being a living person? And I think these questions have to be debated somehow and not just happening. They have to be put into words.
Right, right. We are all wounded healers who have been so gratified by the work we do with the elimination of anything else in our lives that might bring gratification. And yet there are things, and I think the four of us, really all of us, Gabriele, are you retired already, or are you just thinking about it?
I'm nearly retired.
Okay, well, I retired a few years ago.
One analysis.
I retired a few years ago, anticipating it and speaking to my patients and cutting down slowly. It was difficult and I was certainly mourning, but I'm still able to teach and to supervise. So you can go on if your brain is still working, because that other thing is the dementia, which everyone is worried about. We have things we can do in the analytic world, and we could also get together as groups of retirees and make projects if there's such a wish to do so. But there's one more to Audrey. In your experience, have you found yourself shoring up the positive internal objects, or have you found it particularly helpful that the negative internal objects continue to be addressed with ensuing conflict resolution?
Thank you for that question. Let me think how I want to answer that. So I think that naturally, the first thing I want to say is that, as I mentioned in my talk, that the patients begin to work on this with some pre-conscious awareness of the importance. So they are taking in, I think, good analytic work. The patient will experience your goodness as a good internal object who is trying to help them to grow and to live with the reality of finality and uncertainty and separation and aloneness. So I think that if by just pursuing your work as you ordinarily pursue it, the patient has that of a model of someone who is solid and available to help you face frightening things. On the other hand, about the negative objects, what I've seen the patients do that I did not expect, I've learned from simply being in the treatment situation with the patient, is that the patients begin to find the goodness of objects. It doesn't mean they turn bad objects into good objects. I want to make that very clear. There aren't just good objects and bad objects. That's a little too dichotomous. They begin to find the goodness of the objects that they have so struggled with to feel positive about. So, for example, in the example I created, the patient who degraded the mother for unreasonable basis may have felt neglected in certain way. Mother may not have been attentive to her. The patient may have been degrading the mother and feel that she wasn't adequate in many ways. But what the patient started to do was focus on how the model that the mother set for dealing with loss, that she would been widowed and felt that she had to cope in a powerful way. So my sense is it's not simply about goodness and badness, but that the patients begin on their own. That's the impressive part, to start to look for the goodness in all objects in order to find the fortitude to face the end of life.
I'd like to add, Erik Erikson talks about this final stage as generativity, but there is a concept that there are some people in the American are studying called existential maturity. And I think we analysts all should strive for that in terms of a positive way to think about our aging and ending, to think about ourselves as maturing over the lifespan. And I'm hoping that maybe those institutions who are reluctant to look at this will find the strength to do so. So let me see, is there another? Yes.
Can I just add something? I don't know about the US and or Germany, but in my country, many people form private supervision groups after having trained. And I have had such a group. We are 7 members and we have been working together for almost 2 decades. And it's so valuable for us now, because one after another retires and people get all sorts of health problems, and we can share this and discuss it and support each other when it comes to how to end our work and how to end it in a way that is good for our patients, etc. It's very valuable.
Right. I think there's been some research in Chicago that the persons who post-graduation join peer groups of their choosing for consultation, support, etc., that those are the ones that have the strongest psychoanalytic practice and identity for a long time. So I certainly support that for many reasons, including the retirement issue, right?
Especially.
Especially. Yes, go on, Gabriele.
I just wanted to add that sometimes it's very helpful also to do this on an international level, because if you're still in the process of retiring, you have certain questions you can really discuss at home. So if it is possible to form a group of colleagues, or at least one good friend or two good friends in another country, it's very helpful to cross the border.
Well, that's the beauty of the International Psychoanalytic. We get to meet people from all over. So I think that's a great idea. Maybe the four of us should think about that in the future. I don't think there are any other questions. So I want to really thank you all for participating. I want to remember, where is the book? I wanted to hold up this. This is really, and your new book, we don't have a picture of the new book, do we, Gabriele?
Oh, no, I haven't.
And I think we have 15 more minutes and more questions.
I have the German edition, if someone would prefer to read it in German.
And I just can show this book.
Yes, Living in Containment. Yes.
Because some problems are elaborated in this book as well, in terms of how the institution can go on with this problem.
In the paper that I wrote, Conundrums, yes, thank you. Conundrums and Complexities in Treating the Dying Candidate. The problem was the patient, my analyst, was so difficult to accept her diagnosis that she didn't feel equipped and regulated enough to tell her patients all at once, because each time she had to tell a patient that she's not going to be able to continue, once again, she felt the overwhelming anxiety of her impending death. So it's very important that we all think about these things in terms of our analysts who are struggling to integrate a diagnosis and be able to handle it in a way that's protective of the patient. So Tove, your first analyst did that, is that correct? But did he tell me a little bit more how it went at the end?
Well, the thing is that he got ill, and he. What's your question?
So the first analyst is the one that had the myocardial infarct, the heart attack?
No, that's the first analyst was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he stopped his practice immediately, because he said that he wouldldn't like to, even if he would be able to work for shorter periods, he wouldn't expose neither the patients nor himself to such a compromised situation, as he said. So he
was able to accept the diagnosis and immediately plan to end. Is that right?
Definitely, yes. And he was very frank about everything, and he also informed me about what was going on. I mean, I wasn't left to all kinds of fantasies about because this was very much a real life event.
Right,
And
but he had
so he related to it as such. Does
right.
that answer?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
May I?
Yes, go
May
ahead.
I just
Yeah.
answer to the question 4? What are your thoughts when an analyst with an illness, potentially terminal, resists to refer his or her patient? I think this is a very, very important question, because it shows us how analysts feel that patients, or going on with patients, keeps them alive.
Mhm.
And I think here it is the question if there are colleagues who really can have an open word with this colleague and telling him or her that there is responsibility of the group to look after the health and the possibility if he really is able to have the full basket of tools available at this moment. I have experienced such a situation myself, and I must confess that there are sometimes situations as if the group is hypnotized and totally unable to really address this colleague. And one has to speak about it. I mean, it happens, and sometimes one cannot help it. It just happens. But it's important from hindsight to discuss what did happen without the possibility to reflect on it. There are so many things in the institutes that happen without reflection, and I think is such a big basket of good ideas to talk about.
Right, and what we know is analysans who get the feeling something's wrong with their analysts, they tend to stay and become caregivers to the analyst, which is a reversal and an ethical issue that we hope we can prevent.
I also, though, can connect what Gabriele's saying with your paper, Brenda, because that paper that you just referenced about the candidate who was dying really touched me deeply, because it made me appreciate the difference between what the ideal expectations that we hold for us or ourselves as analysts, that somehow when you're an analyst and you get a diagnosis of a fatal, with a fatal diagnosis, that somehow you're supposed to suddenly be able to both take in the personal impact of that, you have to metabolize this, and do the right thing, execute the right thing in terms of the patients immediately. And I think that this is an unrealistic expectation. Yes, it's an ideal, but the ideal has to permit that we have to have the humanity of the analyst in mind, who first has to be able to metabolize it for themselves. I am dying. And can I bear that? And what can I bear? You have to be able to bear it yourself before you can begin to share it with the patients for whom you want to be, a sturdy helper for them to face it as well. So, I think it's important to have ideals. I think it's equally important for us to realize that that's what they are, ideals and models that we may not be able to achieve.
I'm getting the signal that I should wrap up, Tove. So can you make it brief?
But yes, I just wanted to ask something, because in my country, every psychoanalyst is either a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And in this country, there is an age limit of 80 years to practice. So everybody has to stop by 80 years. You can apply for 1 year at a time, and then you have to give a very good reason why you want to continue. That, of course, doesn't preclude that people can work, like you said, Brenda, as supervisors. But we can't take patients anymore when we get 80 years.
Not true in our country, but I must say that I have a renewed sense of wonder at how people with different psychic vulnerabilities and sensibilities have grappled with these enormous psychological challenges. The ubiquity of the calamities that befall us all, yet there's such a gift of being in our profession. This webinar should inspire us to do better as we are aging. There are lessons to be learned for all of us, despite our denials. There is no escaping our eventual mortality. Thank you so much. I think we're going to hear about the next webinar. Is that correct? Hello, hello. Well, evidently, whoever is keeping time doesn't match mine. So I want to just say that I will remind everyone, groups of support is really important for psychoanalysts. A psychoanalytic will is required in my institution, and hopefully it will be for everyone. And there's lots to think about, and existential maturity and life goes on even after you're 80. I will let people know, only because this is going to be on YouTube forever. I am soon to turn 84, and I've really enjoyed the extra time to take care of my exercise, as well as a delight to supervise. And Tove, you're singing, right?
Well, yes, I am singing. I still sing. Yes. So of course that is another part of that keeps me alive. But even so, I should say, since it's a bit special, I think it's so important that people don't work from 7 till 11 at night, but that people have a life with friends and with family and dogs and whatever. I think it's so important that we don't spend all our times behind the couch. Don't you think so?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have,
well, we know so well that in psychosomatic thinking, about psychoanalytic somatic thinking, the body is representing. Sometimes we do not have the best relation to our body, and perhaps because we had not so many good internalized remembrances.
here's the upcoming webinar, Behind the Scenes of Toxic Polarization, Consequences of a Divided World. 17th of November, the same time as this one. The moderator is Chris Heath, and the speakers are Heribert Blas, Claudio Eisrich, Susan Kolode, and I'm sure it'll be a very timely webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So glad you registered.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.